Let's now implement dates in our application. And to see what we have to do, so where we have dates in our application, let's go to our demo here. And so we have the date first here, and then also in all of these movements. So each of them here, besides the deposit and the value itself, like we have it now, we also now need the date here. And so that's the reason why in our account objects, we actually now have the movement dates. It's so that we can display them here. But let's start with this date here. And actually the very first thing that I want to do is to basically fake it that we are always logged in. Okay, so let me do that here. Fake always logged in. And so this way we don't have to always log in each time we want to do something. So to that, let's set the current account to account 1. Then let's call update UI with that current account. And also we need to make the user interface visible with this here. Okay. So these 3 lines will now make it so that Jonas is automatically logged in, except for the message here, but that doesn't really matter. Okay. So as I was saying, let's start by displaying the current balance here. So as I was saying, let's now create this date here. Okay, and let's check out the class name. So that's as always a little bit hidden. So it's the class date. Okay, and so that is already selected at label date. And once more, let's start by setting this date outside here of any callback function so that we can see the effects as we implement our code. So anyway, let's start by creating the current date. And so remember, that is simply by doing new date. And so that is basically right now. However, we don't just want to print that. So let's see how that would look like. So label date, as I have already selected, which again is this element with the class of date, and then text content, and let's set it to now. And so this result here is not exactly what we want, right? So instead, we really only want the day, the month, and the year. And I want to display it in this format. So I want day, then month, and then year. And so this is how we display it in Europe, or at least in Portugal, where I am located. Okay. Now, of course, you can format it in any way that you want. For example, how it looks like in your country, but I will do it like this now. Now, later in this section, we will learn about something called internationalization, which sounds very complicated, but it will allow us to format dates and time according to the user's location, basically. So if the user was in Portugal, then the date would automatically be formatted this way. But if the user was, for example, in the US or in India or wherever, then the date would be formatted in the way that it is usually formatted in that country. All right? So to do this, we need to get the day, month, and year. So let's create variables for each of them. All right. So we take now, and then we call the getDate method, just like we learned in the last video. Then let's take the month, which is now.getMonth. And remember that this one is 0 based. So I'm going to add 1 here. And then the year, which is now.getFullYear. And actually, let's also get the hour and the minute so we can display that as well. So get hours and const the minutes, get minutes. Okay, and now that we have that, all we have to do is to build a nice string with that. So that's the day slash the month slash the year. And then I want a comma and the hour and the minute. So min. All right, and that looks a lot better. Now here in Portugal, whenever the month and the year is only one digit here, then we usually write 08 and 02. So basically we pad this number here with a 0 on the left. All right, so let's do that with the day and with the month, because this is actually a good use case for this method that we studied earlier. So on the day and on the month, we want to use dot pad start. And actually this needs to be a string now. And so let's make it a template literal. Like this. So basically this is now a string. And so on that string, we can call pad start. And then we want this always to be 2 characters long. And we want to pad it with a 0. And probably just writing 0 would work just the same. And so now we get 02. But if the day would be, let's say 12, then that 0 will not be added because the final length that we're looking for is always 2. Okay, and the same with the month. So let's copy it here. And beautiful. So that looks perfect. And now let's move on to actually use the dates here on the movements. Okay. Just keep in mind that, of course, as the time goes on, this value here is not going to change. So this is static, right? So if we wanted to keep displaying the actual time, we would need something called a timer, which is something that we will do by the end of the lecture. We will not do it for this, but we will implement a timer like this. Maybe you have seen it counting down here. So this logout timer. All right, so this time here is going to stay static, but yeah, that's not a big deal for now. But anyway, let's now go to the function which displays these movements. So display movements. So here it is. All right. And so now besides the movements, we also want to display the times of these movements. But now we actually have a problem, because into this function, we are only passing the movements array itself, right? However, we also want the, let's see, we also want the movement dates. And so the best thing to do is to simply pass in the entire account into this function here as well. So just like we already have it in these two, where we already passed in the entire account, let's do the same here as well. So just the account. And then here we need to say account.movement and here account.movements. And finally, where we call this function, we then need to pass in also the entire account. And so that's here in the display UI function. Okay. And so now it is a good thing that we have this refactored function that we created in the last section, where we call all of these methods here only in one place. And so now we only needed to change calling this display movements function here in this one place. And so that's the whole goal of refactoring. It is making it easier to implement new features as time moves on. All right. So let's see how we could do that. So in here, we are looping over the movements. So that's this array that we compute here, which is whether the sorted movements or simply the movements themselves, right? So we are looping over this, and in each iteration, we are generating this HTML. And so now we simply need to add one more element here to this HTML, which is going to contain that date. So let's do that. So in our HTML, we can see that there is this element here called movements date. So let's copy that and paste it right here after the type. Okay. And so let's actually create a variable out here and then put that variable right here. Let's call it display date. Okay. Now, where is the date actually coming from? Well, as we already know, it is in the accounts.movementDates, right? And so here we are looping over the movements. And so at the same time, basically, we also need to loop over the movement dates, okay? But that's not a problem because we already have the index here. And so what we can do is to write account or ACC dot movement dates, and then we take it at position I. So that is the current index in the movements array, and the same index is then going to point to the equivalent date in this movements date array. All right, so this is a common technique of looping over two arrays at the same time. So we call the for each method on one of them. So that's the movements. And then we use the current index to also get the data from some other array. Okay, and so that's going to be at the same position because we're using the same index. So let's create a new date out of this, because as we saw before, this is going to be a nicely formatted time string, right? And so we can use that string to create a new date object. And we need that object so that then from there we can call our usual methods to get the date and the month and the year. Okay, so that's the reason why we need to convert these strings back into a JavaScript object, because only then we can actually work with that data. And now let's actually create these same variables that we already have here. So there's no need to repeat it all. Let's actually get all of this and then delete what we don't need to make this a little bit faster. So we don't need the hour and the minute. So we don't need this. And we want to create this variable called display date. So the date that we're ultimately going to use here. Display date. And now here we need to change from now to date like this. All right. And we see it already worked. Great. So let's compare it actually here with the dates. So July 12, 2020. And yeah, that works. Here then we have 11, which for some reason is also 12. But I guess it's because we're close to midnight here. And so for some reason, probably it then changes over to the next day. Then here we have 27 of May. And so that's also what we get here, all the way to the last one, which is 18 of November, so 2019. So this is accurate. Great. Now, when we click here on the sort, it's probably not going to work. So we get some kind of error here. So cannot read property slice of undefined. Let's see why that is. Well, that's weird, because account.movements here is clearly defined. It shouldn't be undefined. Let's set this here to true by default. And so, well, now it is sorted. So very weird that we get this bug as we click here. let's just log to the console. But indeed, this one here will be not undefined. But actually it now is undefined. So we get account.movements is undefined right now. And that's weird. But I guess it has something to do with the fact that we faked or log in here. So never mind. Let's take a look at this later. Okay, let's just not sort for now until we are back to having our application normal. All right. So actually, let's take this code here now and put it into the code that is executed when we log in. So besides this welcome message, we then also want to create the current date. Okay, so it's back to the original now. Let's now log in. And then we get the message here and the correct date. But now what I wanted to show you is what happens when we request a loan. So you see that we get this error here, right? And that's because this movement doesn't have any date, right? And that's why we get not a number in all the three values. So we need to fix that. So essentially, whenever there is a new transfer or a new loan, we need to not only push the new value into the movements array, but also into the movement dates. All right. So let's actually see that in code. So that's account 1. And so we see that the movements has now 9 elements, while the dates only has 8. All right. So we need to fix that. So let's come here to the transfer. And then besides doing the transfer and updating the UI, we also need to add transfer date. But that's easy enough. All we have to do is current account dot movement dates dot push, and then simply create the current date. So new date, and that's it. So JavaScript will then automatically convert this date here into a nicely formatted string. All right. And now the same here also for the receiver, because the receiver also gets a new movement here. Okay. And so they also need a new date for that movement. Now, as I told you also in the last section at the beginning of the project, in the real world, we would probably have an object for each movement. And so that object would then contain the amount, the date, and some other information about the movement. But I don't want to restructure the entire application now, and so therefore I simply created this separate movements dates array. All right. Now let's just take this here and also add it to the loan. So that's right here. So add loan date, and that should be it. So just to make sure here, let's really log in again. All right. And now I'm going to request this loan. And now we get the current date. So August 2nd, just as we have it up here. Okay. So let's see now the account. So account 1. Let's take a look at the movement dates. And so indeed, this is the one, or actually this is the one that I just added. So this looks a little bit different from these ones, because actually it is really the object itself. All right, so that's not good. So let's instead use the toISO string right here on the date and do the same also up here. Okay, and let's see if that fixes it then. Okay, so probably there was some error here because we're back to having not a number. And, oh, actually I need to take a look at account 1 now again. And so let's check out the latest date. Oh, and I didn't call the method. Ah, that was stupid. Actually, this is something that happens to me quite frequently with these date methods, because we don't have to pass anything in there. And so there's a tendency to forget that we even need to call the method. So don't make that same mistake. All right, and now it works indeed. So let's check if the string looks nice with the same format as all the others. And yeah, it does. And so with this, we finished one more lecture. Now here, I'm actually seeing something weird. So it's 19.1, but this should kind of be 0.1, shouldn't it? So we need to apply some padding to that as well. So that's a good coincidence that we are just at this time where I can see this. So let's go ahead quickly and fix that right here in the login callback. So that's here. And so essentially what we just need to do is to add this part to the hour and to the minute. So we make all of them a template literal again. And then like this. One more time. Okay, to see the effect, we need to log in. And beautiful. So that's a lot better. And now we indeed finished this lecture and are ready to move on to the next one, where we're going to work just a little bit more with dates.